Natural selection. Natural selection is the process by which evolution produces adaptation. Other processes, such as genetic drift, cause evolution to occur. But in a random direction, only natural selection guides the evolutionary process in a direction that produces adaptation to environmental and social conditions. Natural selection is the process that was first clearly explained by Charles Darwin. See Darwin, Charles, Origin of Species book. Although some earlier writers such as W.C. Wells, Edward Blyth, and Patrick Matthew had presented fragments of the idea, natural selection was independently discovered by Wallace. See Wallace Alfred Russell. Darwin not only demonstrated that evolution had occurred, but also explained how it occurred. Evolution became believable for the first time. Darwin's contemporaries largely accepted his demonstration that evolution had occurred, but the scientific community did not embrace natural selection for another 80 years. See modern synthesis. Sexual selection, which was also first elucidated by Charles Darwin, operates in a manner similar to natural selection. Many evolutionary scientists consider it a subset of natural selection. However, sexual selection usually produces arbitrary and sometimes outlandish characteristics that are not usually considered adaptation. Both Darwin and Wallace alluded to artificial selection, which is the process by which humans breed crops and livestock in desired directions, in crafting the phrase natural selection. In both cases, some individuals are selected to propagate, and others are not selected to propagate. Only in natural selection it is nature rather than humans that is doing the selecting. Both artificial and natural selection can produce genetic changes within populations and can cause divergence of populations into different varieties. Either could eventually cause varieties to be different enough that they would constitute different species. Artificial selection, however, has not gone on long enough for this to happen. Natural selection occurs within populations. Individual organisms cannot evolve because they cannot undergo whole body genetic changes. See Mendelian genetics. If mutations occur in somatic cells, which make up most of the body of an animal, the cells that contain the mutations will die when the organism dies. Only those mutations that occur in germline cells, either eggs or sperm, or the cells that produce them, can be passed on to the next generation. Therefore, the genetic effects of evolution can only be observed in the next generation of the population. Natural selection occurs because individuals within populations differ from one another in how successfully they reproduce. Evolutionary theories before Darwin, see Lamarckism by Robert Lamarck, were incorrectly based upon the transformation of an entire population or species. Because some individuals in the population reproduce more successfully than others, over time the population begins to resemble these successful individuals. Ernst Mayr said that by formulating the theory of natural selection, Darwin introduced population thinking into evolution to replace typological thinking. That is, evolution occurs in populations of diverse individuals rather than being the transformation of one type into another. And we will cover evolution, Mendelian genetics, sexual selection and adaptation, as well as artificial selection and other readings. First, we will talk about the process of natural selection. Ernst Mayr summarized the process of natural selection as 5 facts and 3 inferences that can be derived from those facts. All of these facts are part of the science of ecology, which is the study of the relationship between organisms and their living and non-living environments. Therefore, by elucidating the process of natural selection, Darwin was not only making evolution believable for the first time, but also inventing the science of ecology as well. Fact number 1. Populations can grow exponentially. Because reproductive groups of individuals can multiply, populations grow in curves, not in lines. In a population of bacteria, one bacterium can produce but 1 million bacteria can produce 2 million bacteria during cell division. This allows populations to grow explosively. This will occur, of course, only in an unlimited environment. As Darwin wrote, quote, "There is no exception to the rule that every organic being naturally increases at so high a rate that if not destroyed, the earth would be covered by the progeny of a single pair. Even slow-breeding man has doubled in 25 years, and at this rate, in less than 1,000 years, there would literally not be standing room for his progeny. Linnaeus has calculated that if an annual plant produced only 2 seeds, and there is no plant so unproductive as this, and their seedlings next year produce 2, and so on, then in 20 years there should be 1 million plants." End quote. Darwin did some calculations for the origin of species, incorrectly, as it turned out, on the reproductive rate and population growth of elephants in an unlimited environment. Quote, he said, "The elephant is reckoned the slowest breeder of all known animals, and I have taken some pains to estimate its probable minimum rate of natural increase. It will be safest to assume that it begins breeding when 30 years old and goes on breeding until 90 years old, bringing forth 6 young in the interval and surviving until 100 years old. If this be so, after a period of from 740 to 750 years, there would be nearly 19 million elephants alive, descended from the first pair." End quote. Fact number 2. Populations sometimes grow and sometimes become smaller, but tend to remain stable. Therefore, something must be preventing population growth, either by repressing reproduction or by causing death. Darwin wrote, quote, "Lighten any check, mitigate the destruction ever so little, and the number of the species will almost instantaneously increase to any amount." End quote. Darwin insisted on evidence and on experimentation where possible. He dug and cleared a small part of ground at his estate and laboriously marked each seedling that germinated. The total was 357. Of these, 295 seedlings died, mainly because slugs and insects ate them. He also counted the number of bird nests on his property in the spring of 1854 and again in the spring of 1855, and estimated that during the intervening winter, nearly 4/5 of the birds had died. Fact number 3. Resources are limited. Ultimately, if reproduction continued unabated, the world could not contain the offspring, as Darwin wrote. However, resources are limited by much more than simply room in the world. Organisms need resources and ecosystem services that provide food, water, shelter, and oxygen, and process their wastes. Each kind of organism is adapted to live in only a limited range of conditions. Therefore, for a polar bear, it does not much matter how big the world is, but only how big the Arctic is. And, of course, we know that as its biome. And for species that are limited to a single island or mountain or swamp, the world is very small. The disparity between limited resources and exponential population growth in human societies had been famously pointed out by Malthus, C. Thomas Malthus, and Darwin simply applied it to nature. Quote, "It is the doctrine of Malthus applied with manifold force to the whole animal and vegetable kingdoms." End quote. These 3 facts lead to inference 1. Again, fact number 1 is that populations can grow exponentially. Fact 2 is that populations sometimes grow and sometimes become smaller, but tend to remain stable. And fact number 3 is that resources are limited. So, from these 3 facts lead to inference 1, which is the struggle for existence. In nearly all natural populations, there are not enough resources for all of the individuals to have all of the resources that they need. Today, scientists say that competition occurs in nearly all natural populations nearly all of the time. Sometimes competition is strong enough that scientists can actually observe the struggle. In a jungle, vines grow over trees, and trees crowd together as if they are fighting for access to the light. In a desert, the bushes are evenly spaced across the landscape because there is not enough water for any bush to grow close to another bush. Predators fight over a kill, and birds chase one another out of the choice territories. But even when it cannot be seen, competition can be inferred. Competition is the unavoidable result of exponential population growth and limited resources. As Darwin wrote, quote, "Nothing is easier than to admit in words the truth of the universal struggle for life, or more difficult, at least I have found it so, than constantly to bear this conclusion in mind. We behold the face of nature bright with gladness. We often see superabundance of food. We do not see, or we forget, that the birds that are idly singing around us live on insects or seeds and are thus constantly destroying life, or we forget how largely these songsters or their eggs or their nestlings are destroyed by birds or beasts of prey. We do not always bear in mind that though food may now be superabundant, it is not so at all seasons of each recurring year." End quote. Darwin's theory of evolution by means of natural selection severely shook the complacency of European science, which had comfortably assumed the divine creation and long-term stability of species. His invention of ecology had at least as great an effect on scientific and popular thought. Many people thought of the natural world as God's vast and orderly garden full of life. Darwin showed the natural world to be violent and full of death. To his readers, Darwin had shaken their view of the world, and they had not even gotten past chapter 3, which was titled "The Struggle for Existence of the Origin of Species." The poet Alfred Lord Tennyson reflected the sadness not only of the death of individuals, but the extinction of species in his poem In Memoriam, which is the origin of the famous phrase, "red in tooth and claw." Of course, Tennyson published the poem before Darwin wrote his book. The fact of extinction may have forced scholars to think about the fact that disease and death, often the result of the struggle for existence, was much more painful than it needed to be in a perfectly ordered world. Darwin experienced this firsthand through the death of his mother when he was young. Even without evolution, religious scholars had and still have to struggle with the problem of natural evil. Fact 4, each individual in a population is unique. Each population contains a tremendous amount of diversity. Humans can easily observe this diversity in their own populations, but it is true of the populations of all other species as well, even if humans cannot recognize it. Darwin learned this not from other scientists, but from animal breeders, particularly pigeon. All the different breeds of pigeon had been selected from ancestral stocks of rock pigeons. Columbalivia. These breeds included some with outlandish feathers, anatomy, for instance, the ability to inflate their crops massively, or behaviors such as the ability to tumble during flight. Since all of these breeds had come from rock doves, then all of their characteristics had to be present, but hidden within the rock dove populations. Breeding brought out these traits, distilling them as one might distill brandy from wine. The first 2 chapters of The Origin described how artificial selection and the observation of natural populations showed the tremendous amount of diversity that they contained. And fact number 5, much of the variability in populations is hereditable. Darwin knew nothing about genetics. He was apparently unaware of the writings, see Gregor Mendel, that explained how traits could be passed from one generation to another, but every plant and animal breeder knew that this was the case. There was confusion about the mechanism. Many scientists held varieties of Lamarckism, or the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Many also believed in blending inheritance, in which parental traits blended permanently in their offspring, like blending different colors of a paint. Mendel, in contrast, was one of the researchers who demonstrated that traits were inherited in a particular rather than a blending fashion. That is, a trait could disappear in one generation and reappear in another, like mixing different colors or marbles rather than of paint. Darwin himself ended up accepting a variation of Lamarckism, which he called pangenesis, a theory that today most evolutionary scientists consider to be his only major blunder. The first inference, plus facts 4 and 5, and again, the first inference is the struggle for existence, plus facts 4 and 5, which fact 4 is that each individual in a population is unique, and fact 5 that much of the variability in populations is hereditable, give rise to inference number 2, which is natural selection itself. In order to reproduce, an individual needs to obtain resources beyond just what is needed for survival. Because of the struggle for existence, which was inference number 1, not all individuals in the population can reproduce or even survive. If all individuals in the population were alike, then the ones that prevailed would be due to either the chance or to historical contingency, which might just be another form of chance. But since individuals are unique, then some of the individuals have what it takes to survive and reproduce more than others. For example, in a moist environment, some of the plants may have larger leaves and shallower roots than others. The plants with larger leaves could grow faster because they would have greater photosynthesis, and they would not waste their resources producing deep roots that are not needed in a moist environment. But if the trait cannot be passed on to the next generation, the superior survival and reproduction of the plants with larger leaves would not matter, since their offspring would not have leaves any larger than those of other plants. Natural selection is the differential reproduction of organisms in a population for reasons not due to chance. That is all that it is. If some genetically distinct individuals consistently reproduce more than others, natural selection occurs. Scientists may be able to determine what caused the superiority of some individuals over others. See, for example, Darwin's finches. Or they may not. For example, see peppered moths. Either way, natural selection has occurred. As Darwin described it, quote, owing to the struggle for existence, variations, however slight and from whatever cause proceeding, if they be in any degree profitable to the individuals of a species, in their infinitely complex relations to other organic beings and to their physical conditions of life, will tend to the preservation of such individuals, and will generally be inherited by the offspring. I have called this principle, by which each slight variation, if useful, is preserved, by the term natural selection. End quote. Inference 2 leads directly to inference 3. And again, inference 2 is natural selection. Inference 3, which is that if natural selection continues long enough, evolutionary change results in the population. The traits that confer superiority in natural selection, therefore in evolution, are not the same everywhere. There are countless pathways to success in the natural world, as in the human economy. The above example described successful plants in a moist environment as having large leaves and shallow roots. In an arid environment, successful plants would have small leaves which waste less water than large leaves and deep roots that may be able to tap into new sources of water. In most cases, evolution can go in more than one direction depending on the circumstances. To use one example, the major pattern of evolution in the human lineage, for example, has been the increase in brain case or brain size. Actually, see Australopithecines, which we will discuss later, such as Homo habilis, Homo ergaster, Homo sapiens. But in at least one case, human brain size decreased during evolution. And for example, you can see the Flores Island people. In the next couple of readings, we'll talk about natural selection, types of natural selection observed in nature, natural selection experiments, the importance of natural selection to all of society. Now we will discuss types of natural selection. Evolutionary scientists generally classify natural selection into 3 types. First, in stabilizing selection, the average individuals reproduce better than the extreme individuals. For example, in an environment with medium humidity, very large-leaved and very small-leaved individuals in a plant population would grow more slowly and reproduce less. Stabilizing selection reinforces the mean or average trait value by eliminating outlying variation. Stabilizing selection may be common in populations once a particularly successful combination of genes has been assembled. According to some evolutionary scientists, stabilizing selection has been the experience of nearly every species during most of its existence, resulting in long periods of evolutionary stasis, or punctuated equilibria. Second, in directional selection, again, we're talking about types of natural selection. The first we discussed was stabilizing selection, and now we're moving on to directional selection, in which individuals at one end of the extremes reproduce better than either the average individuals or the individuals at the other extreme. If the environment of the population of plants described above became wetter, the larger leaved individuals would grow and reproduce better than the individuals with either medium or small leaves. A drier environment would favor the individuals with small leaves over all the others. Either of these would be directional selection. Third, diversifying selection. In diversifying selection, the average individuals are at a disadvantage and the extreme individuals reproduce the most. During intense competition, the average individuals may compete most strongly. Individuals that are very small or very large might escape direct competition, and as a result, the population may begin evolving in two directions at once. This process cannot continue as long as the individuals can all interbreed. If a reproductive barrier arises between the small and large individuals, they may begin to diversify into two species. See reproductive isolation and speciation. Darwin neatly explained how a population could evolve, perhaps eventually becoming a new species. Natural selection does not itself explain how one species can evolve into two or more species. Reproductive isolation must also occur. And of course, we'll discuss evolution itself in another reading. Another type of natural selection is called frequency-dependent selection, and it is a special instance in which an individual has greater reproductive success, not because of better adaptation to environmental conditions, but simply from being rare. The most commonly cited example of frequency-dependent selection is that of sex ratios. See the evolution of sex. If males are rare in a population, the average male will leave more offspring than the average female. Conversely, rare females will leave more offspring on the average than common males. Whichever sex is rare enjoys greater reproductive success. Frequency-dependent selection is considered to be the main process by which most animal populations maintain an equal mix of males and females. There are limitations of natural selection. There are physical constraints, phyletic constraints, an absence of genetic variation, linkage of traits, plasticity and dispersal, post-reproductive individuals, the future, and group selection. Natural selection is not all-powerful. Now we will discover examples of limitations upon the power of natural selection. Physical restraints. Natural selection cannot cause the evolution of characteristics that violate the laws of physics and chemistry. For example, natural selection cannot produce a large animal with skinny legs. See allometry. Also, the tallest trees in the world are about 350 feet, about 70 meters tall. Trees much taller than this are not possible because there is a maximum height to which wood can conduct water, and the tallest redwoods may be very close to this maximum height. Large animals with wheels cannot evolve, for the wheel could not receive nutrition from the rest of the body through the axle. Phyletic constraints. Once an evolutionary lineage has adopted a certain adaptation, this adaptation itself puts constraints on evolutionary change. It is not possible for an animal to have an exoskeleton and to be large. Once arthropods evolved exoskeletons, see evolution of invertebrates, large size could no longer evolve in their lineage. Absence of genetic variation. Natural selection can only choose from among the genetic characteristics that are available in the population. These characteristics arise by chance mutations. Linkage of traits. Natural selection may be unable to select traits separately if they are linked either on the same chromosome as linkage groups in Mendelian genetics or in development. In flowers, petal size and stamen size share developmental events, and natural selection cannot cause one to become bigger or smaller without the other. Plasticity and dispersal. Organisms may respond to changes in environmental conditions by plasticity or acclimation, or by dispersal to a new location. These are ways in which individual organisms can avoid becoming the victims of natural selection. post-reproductive individuals. Natural selection cannot eliminate harmful mutations that have their effect when all or most of the organism's reproduction has been completed. See evolution of life history. This is sometimes called the kingpin principle, based on a story about automobile manufacturer Henry Ford. He had his engineers study old Ford cars and find which part of the old cars was in the best condition. They reported that the kingpins were just like new. Ford told his factory managers to stop wasting their time making such good kingpins. There was no need for kingpins to last forever in a car that did not. Similarly, in organisms, there is no advantage for genes that promote the health and vigor of post-reproductive individuals. The future. Natural selection cannot anticipate the future and prepare for the future. Group selection. Natural selection cannot favor characteristics that benefit the group but reduce the fitness of the individual that possesses them. Some adaptations result in harm for the individual. For example, worker bees that die after stinging a victim, and a mother spider that dies when her spiderlings eat her. But these are compensated by an increase in inclusive fitness. See altruism. When pathogens infect a host, natural selection may favor those selfish lineages of pathogens that reproduce most rapidly, even if the host dies as a result. Natural selection may work against such selfish pathogens if the death of the host results in the death of the entire pathogen population. See group selection. Or if the illness of the host causes other hosts to stay away from the sick individual, thus preventing the dispersal of any pathogens of that population to new hosts. See evolutionary medicine. But natural selection cannot result in individuals sacrificing their own fitness within a population. Natural selection observed in nature. Below are just a few examples of natural selection that have been observed in nature. 1. Stabilizing selection. Evolutionary biologists Arthur Weiss and Warren Abrahamson studied insects that lay their eggs inside of plant stems. And again, study of insects is called entomology. The grub releases a compound that causes the stem to produce a round swelling called a gall. The grub can develop well fed inside this gall. There are dangers from predators, however. Gall wasps can recognize galls and pierce their ovipositors into the gall, laying their eggs on the grub, and the wasp larvae eat the grub. Birds can also recognize galls and tear them open to eat the protein-rich grub. Galled wasps prefer smaller galls. Wasp parasitism therefore selects for larger galls. Birds prefer larger galls. Bird predation therefore selects for smaller ones. The result is what looks like stabilizing selection for medium-sized galls, but it is actually a compromise of two processes of directional selection. Directional selection is the second example of natural selection that have been observed in nature. Soapberry bugs, for example, of the Gedera hymatoloma, pierce fruits of certain plants with their long beaks. They are native to the Keys of Florida, where they obtained their food from native balloon vines. After 1925, landscapers introduced the golden rain tree, which is an Asian relative of the balloon vine but with smaller fruits, into Central Florida. Soapberry bugs began to use the new trees as a food source. In Central Florida, natural selection favored bugs with shorter beaks, and over the next few decades, the Central Florida bug populations evolved shorter beaks, while the bugs in the Keys retained their long ones. Evolutionary scientists Scott Carroll and Christian Boyd documented this change by examining bug collections that had been made before and after the introduction of golden rain trees to Central Florida. The third example of natural selection that has been observed in nature is diversifying selection. In populations of African black-bellied seedcrackers, which is a type of bird, individuals have either large or small beaks, and these two beak sizes correspond to two different kinds of seeds, large versus small, that the birds eat. Juvenile birds have greater variation in beak size than that of adults. Evolutionary biologist Thomas Bates Smith found that the juveniles that survived were those that specialized most narrowly upon the available seed sizes. Among the large-beaked individuals, those with beaks too large or too small died, and among the small-beaked individuals, those with beaks too large or too small also died. Diversifying selection thus reinforced the large and the small beak sizes in this bird population. Concerning natural selection experiments, occasionally natural selection can be verified in natural populations by manipulative experiments, as in these examples. Anole lizards. Anoles are lizards that live in the Caribbean. Some very small Caribbean islands have no natural populations of these anole lizards. And evolutionary biologist Jonathan Losos introduced these lizards onto some of these islands. That islands differed in the relative amount of plant cover. Within 10 to 14 years, recognizably different forms of these lizards had apparently evolved on different islands. Guppies. Guppies live in freshwater pools on the island of Trinidad. In some pools, there are relatively large predators that eat guppies of all sizes. In other pools, there are only small predators which eat only small guppies. The guppies that live with large predators have a more rapid life cycle, growing faster and reaching reproductive maturity sooner than those that live with small predators. Evolutionary biologist David Resnick found some pools that had small predators, no large predators, and also no guppies. This was the perfect opportunity for an experiment. He predicted that if fast-growing guppies that had previously experienced large predators were exposed to this new environment, they would evolve into slower-growing forms. He performed the experiment and obtained the expected results. Importance of natural selection to all of society. Evolution in general, and natural selection in particular, has been a subject of little interest to many students and professors in the health sciences and agriculture. Recent developments, however, have shown that it was disastrous for medical and agricultural professionals to ignore the process of natural selection. See evolution of resistance. In particular, natural selection has led directly to the evolution of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Natural selection in pathogenic bacteria is fast-paced, outrunning the ability of the medical industry to produce new antibiotics. It costs a lot of money, and it kills thousands of people. The evolution of pesticide resistance in mosquitoes, flies, ticks, lice, and other disease vectors presents yet another public health menace. Quite literally, what a person does not know about evolution can kill him or her. Natural selection also occurs everywhere and all the time in agricultural fields as insects evolve resistance to pesticides and weeds evolve resistance to herbicides. The response of many farmers is to spray more with less success, with results in both the poisoning of the environment and the loss of agricultural production. Medical and agricultural professionals, however, have found some degree of success by using the process of natural selection in their favor rather than letting it work against them. By using antibiotics and pesticides sparingly rather than abundantly, and by using mixtures of several types rather than a single type, they have been able to slow down the evolution of resistance. And as ecologist Rachel Carson has indicated, Darwin could not have imagined such a vindication of his theory.